and then we'll jump into a couple of our agenda items, and we'll come back to approve the minutes once we have others join us. So today we're going to be going over, we'll do a couple standing committee updates, although Councilmember Sterner, you're our only council member that was able to attend tonight, so you're on the hook. Then we'll do our EAC subcommittee updates. We're going to talk a bit about the council equity and federal budget allocation. So we'll get a presentation about what was selected and what's moving forward, and then give ourselves a chance to raise some questions to see if there's additional updates or places we want to be giving input. Then we'll be going into a police safety review update. And we'll cover some information about the U.S. Department of Transportation request for information on equity. We'll wrap up with some announcements, including if Anita is here. I'm pretty sure she's planning to attend because she just sent me an email. We'll make space there for her updates about the community work that she's working on.
Okay. Can you see me? I'm here.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I don't get to see all the people at once, but good. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, Councilmember Sterner, are you able to give a standing committee update from the committees that you serve on?
Sure, I can give a brief one in that. So, so we're on the Environment Committee, and we met recently, and we did kind of a rate review for the wastewater, and relatively the rates were kept the same. That kind of affects secondary. So, like the small businesses, the rates were the same, and for the restaurants and that. So that helps our small businesses. And then on the Environment Committee, we feel like we can have, you know, the disadvantaged businesses at a certain percentage, and can still have the lowest bid too. So there was a couple months ago we meetings that there were some bids that were higher, so we rebid out a couple projects. So one of those projects came back, and the numbers for the, you know, the BIPOC numbers, and and our goals were met, and we had the lowest bid. So that was awarded at the last meeting for the janitorial services for the different plants. So that was pretty well, most of it we did. There's a couple of projects going on around the area too, so we discussed those. But as far as pertain to the Equity Advisory Committee, those are probably the two main points I was going to make on that from standing from the Environment Committee. Oh, I guess one more. Just I sit on the Transportation Committee too. So on that one, we had the police chief recently worked with our working group and also with transportation. So they're looking at like for safety and numbers and opening up transportation fully for pre-COVID and that. So a lot of the policing has been rechecked. So every officer has been kind of reviewed, and training's been there. We have the HAT team, which is our housing team for homelessness awareness team, and that. So that one is really proponent, and many of the sometimes when they talk about aggressive things done by the police are generally that's not trained, and there was a very, very low incidence, like way less than like 1,000, so 1% of any incidents that would pertain to something like that. So there's they use a lot more, as our chief calls it, 21st century of policing, which is more of using cameras and awareness and non-uniform personnel, as well as having a quick response team if someone feels uncomfortable or exhibits violence on board and everything. So that's through that as well. So that's pretty well what I have. If there's any questions, I would stand to answer some based on what I have here.
Does anyone have any questions before we move on to our next agenda item, which are our subcommittee updates?
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And we are not quite at quorum yet, but we're getting close. So I'm keeping track of where we are. I realized that I neglected to read the welcome script, so I am going to read that script. Maybe as I'm reading it, we'll have a couple others join us and we'll have quorum in order to approve our minutes. So as you know, welcome to the July meeting of the Equity Advisory Committee. I want to acknowledge that COVID-19 is causing us to alter our usual procedures, and we've invited residents of the region to participate in this meeting virtually. As we know, Governor Walz has declared a peacetime emergency in response to COVID-19, and the Met Council has determined it is not practical or prudent to conduct an in-person committee meeting for reasons stated in our emergency executive order. So we will be participating in this meeting by phone or other electronic means, and this Equity Advisory Committee meeting will be conducted under Minnesota Statute Section 13D-021. I'm going to also give a couple guidelines about WebEx before we get started, which is to please keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. And if you're on phone and your computer, which I don't see anyone is as of yet this evening, but someone may be in the future, just unmute one device when you're speaking so we don't get feedback. Please announce your name before speaking, especially for those of you that don't have your cameras on. It would be helpful to know who's speaking when you speak. And we do all of our votes by roll call. So Arena assists us with that to do a roll call vote. Communicate through speaking. So the chat function can be used to address technical difficulties, such as you can't hear or you have a question that's technical. And you can also type a question in the chat, but avoid having our conversation in the chat because we need to be recording what we're saying to be complying with our accessibility and to be tracking our minutes. Use the raised hand feature if you wish to speak, especially if we get an agenda item that is very active and we get going on it. It's helpful to have the raised hand feature to know who is waiting to say something. And this meeting is being recorded and will be made available online. Arena is going to help me monitor the chat, so reach out to her if you're having any technical issues. And then Arena, if you don't mind putting your phone number in chat. Oh, already done, so that people could reach you. Thank you. And Arena, do you happen to know how close we are to quorum, if we should be doing our approval of minutes at this time?
We are at 8 right now,
At 8.
Madam
Okay.
Chair.
All right, so we will wait on that a little bit. And Anita, you have your hand raised and you are upside down. So
Can
not
you
sure.
hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm having connection issues. I'm going to log out and log back in.
Okay.
I didn't raise my hand. It won't come down.
Okay. Sounds good. All right.
I'll see you back in a bit.
Okay. Great. All right. So we're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is our subcommittee updates. And I'm wondering, Sarah and T, would you like to start us off with an update from the Transportation Subcommittee?
T, I'm wondering if you might be willing to speak on behalf of the committee because I got hit in the mouth with the baseball yesterday and it's difficult.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Bless your heart. Okay, we did have a meeting with Cy just to update her on where we were at. And so that went well. And we've been meeting with TAB monthly and listening to their monthly meetings. So we've been getting to know them pretty well. And asked Cy if she would set up some meetings with the Met Council, not the Met Council, but Metro. And so there's so many names, so please forgive me if I get confused. But so Cy will help with some meetings so we can get better relationships with the transportation. So, and any questions or comments? Okay.
Thank you, T. And I can give an update for the operations subcommittee, and then Michael and Mohammed, if you'd like to add anything, please jump in. We met a few weeks ago with some members of the Met Council who are developing a dashboard, and the dashboard is intended to give information at a glance about things like advancements, hiring, people exiting the council, and be able to be sliced in a number of different ways. So you can see those factors by department, gender, race and ethnicity. And we had the opportunity to view that dashboard at the same time as many staff were first viewing it. So we had the opportunity to give some input as it's being piloted and developed. And that's my main update. Michael or Mohammed, would you add anything to that?
This is Mohammed. No.
Does anyone have any questions before we move on to housing?
No, this is Michael. No, I'm good with where we are. Even though I did not have an opportunity to join you guys during that meeting to review the website, but I believe your judgment is good. It's good.
Thank you, Michael. All right. Brianne, would you like to give an update about the Affordable Housing Subcommittee?
Sure, thanks. Well, we met Friday. Like, what day was it? Friday afternoon. And Leah was joining us as well. And it was me and Edward and Leah. I don't think that's proper English, but I guess that's okay. And the committee, subcommittee, supported myself as becoming the chair. So I think Leah probably is that official? I don't know how that, what the official process is, but I'm happy to do that on behalf of the subcommittee. Housing is my professional field as well as my area of interest and passion, and I think I'll be able to represent the committee well because of that. I'm really excited to do it. I think there's some really passionate people in the subcommittee. It's a really critical time right now for Met Council policy-wise with the update of the housing policy plan, which I know from experience is a very powerful document. Sometimes when you look at these giant documents on paper, you think, what influence do they have? They have incredible influence. And so I'm really excited to represent the EAC and the subcommittee in driving influence over that plan, more than just updates from the staff and updates on how it's going, more really driving the development of the work. So I think we didn't take any action or do any beginnings of that work at the meeting. The second thing on our work plan is to convene regional discussions about housing around particular priorities related to deeply affordable. That's what they call 30% area median income housing, deeply affordable housing, which is reflected in our goals, among other things. But so that'll also be exciting to work with staff to start doing some of that regional housing convening. So that's the update I have, just kind of a status update on what our plan is, and hope to work together to get it done over the next year.
Thank you. One thing I will add about any of the committees, if you haven't had a chance to get involved in one and you are interested, I can connect you, or you can feel free to reach out to anyone that spoke this evening. All right, so we are going to move into our presentation on the council equity and federal budget. So I'm going to turn it over to Cy, and then Cy, Jordan, and Terry Smith will both be giving us a presentation.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. Cy Jordan, Director of the Office of Equal Opportunity, and we have a mixed discussion for you today. One, we want to do a quick refresh and overview of where we're at with the equity, advancing equity funding, as well as share with you information around Transit's federal use of funding and that allocation of one-time funds. And then Terri Smith is here with us from Metro HRA through Community Development Division, and she can speak more directly to the federal funds allocated related to HRA. And so with that, we want to pull up the presentation for the equity funds. And as we're doing that, I'll give you some highlights. I won't walk through them all today. What I understand the EAC's interest in is one, again, an overview of where we're at with the funding allocation. And then there will be some further discussion in the subcommittee work that pertains to their particular interests. So certain equity fund allocations are directed towards employment advancement and opportunity. There are equity funding that is specific to our small business use. So within those operations subcommittee, we can have those conversations. Those funds that are directed towards housing will continue to have conversations and understand where EAC can be further involved through the housing subcommittee as well. And then there's the opportunity for transportation subcommittee to also have some further input with regard to those equity allocations. So I will not go through each of the slides, but I do want to move through them a little quickly. We have 7 designated advancing functions, and so as another highlight, we have $4 million is directed toward the LHIA grant, so the livable housing. And that is in addition to the 1.6 million that's otherwise associated with 6 projects. And so again, 4 million towards the local housing incentives account program. And then we have the original 1.6 million that's allocated across another 6, actually across another 5 projects. The 6 being that there is funding dedicated for temporary staff to support these equity initiatives directed towards human resources and procurement. So $300,000 will go to staffing for human resources and procurement. $600,000 is awarded for the advancing equity in the region through subcontracting, $100,000 through the environmental services youth job skills program, $250,000 towards the equity evaluation of regional transportation investment, $200,000 towards the maintenance technical training, and then another $150,000 for the expanding multicultural marketing reach and frequency. This information has been shared with the EAC in the past through the business item when it was first approved in April of 2021, and let you know the status of where the funding is. These programs are actually just starting to receive the actual dollars and funds. And at the next management committee meeting on July 28th, they will be reviewing a operating budget amendment, which simply means that they will be making the decision to actually move the funds into these account strings for these projects for use. and submitting expenses toward the funds. And then there will be a council vote in that same direction on August 11th of 2021. I can speak most specifically to the first project that's on the PowerPoint slide, which is the advancing equity in the region through contracting. OEO has direct responsibility and partnership in that particular allocation. And with the financial incentives for exceeding MCUB goals, we are working with environmental services and also with Metro Transit Engineering and Facilities, and looking also at another opportunity for an FRP to decide what would be the best project to dedicate those this initiative towards. And then we're also in the Office of Equal Opportunity responsible for building capacity for the MCUB business. That refers to the support of us starting a new unit within the Office of Equal Opportunity of the Engagement Development Unit, where we'll be able to offer one-on-one services to small businesses and actually help and support them with development and removal of barriers to subcontracting at the council. We're in the process of posting for a supervisor for that unit, as well as an additional equal opportunity specialist, and we hope to have that have those postings live by the end of this month, or certainly by early August. Any initial thoughts? I know a part of this is that we want to get any immediate questions that the EAC may have that you'd want us to prepare the staff who are leading this work to be responsive to as you invite them to your subcommittee meetings for some deeper engagement.
Sai, just in case any of our members are unfamiliar with the acronym, do you mind sharing what the MCUB program is?
Oh, certainly, the Metropolitan Council Underutilized Business Program. So that is, it is comparable to the DBE, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program. The DBE focuses on federal funds. The MCUB program is the use of our own local and state funds in the council. Any additional comments or thoughts? And so we'll move to our next PowerPoint for this mixed session. And that's going to be a discussion of one of the interest in the EAC work plan, and also in the standing committee was an update on how the council has used the CARE funds and how they're being allocated, with a specific request to whether or not the EAC could have some input on the use of those funds. And so I do have for you some highlights with regard to the Metro Transit funds. I want to acknowledge I'm not the person with the background and detailed information about the use of these funds, and so certainly we can gather questions from the EAC and bring back staff that can speak more specifically. But I will walk through what has been designated and how the council has used these funds. So if we move to slide number 4, be able to share with you that through the governor's budget recommendations, these were one-time federal relief funds, and they are designated specifically for operating deficits, capital maintenance deficits, transit security, including administrative citations and implementation. And with the request of the EAC being whether or not you could have additional input into the use of these, my understanding is because of the limited designation for these funds, the council's also already made a determination of how they will be allocated within the operation of the council. And so certainly we are open to additional questions that you might have about that and any specifics in these further slides. I know that 15.3 million of the one-time funds were used to improve the safety and security of Metro Transit, and they've been used towards more administrative citations for fare evasion implementation, real-time camera monitoring, and increased police pressure. So that's one example of how they're being used in the operations of the Metropolitan Council. If we go to the next slide. As it's being pulled up again, I'll be able to give you a little bit more background in terms of the CARES Act and how that funding was allocated. And so we received the $25 billion nationally for public transit through the CARES Act funds. That's the amount that was allotted. Metro Transit actually received $226.5 million. We can see the breakdown designations of how they were used. 2.14 to Metropolitan Council, 12.1 to suburban opt-outs, and then 86% of this funding was actually expended in 2020. And so there's a breakdown in how that was already expended, and that's through salaries and benefits, again going to the designation for operations at 83%, contracted transit services such as Metro Mobility and Transit Link at 9%, and then pass-through funds for opt-out providers at 6%, fuel at 1%, and materials and cleaning at 1%. And so that remaining is designated for our year of 2021. And if we go to the next slide. So the COVID response and relief supplemental appropriations, again, it gives that national total and speaks specifically to what was allotted for the Metro Transit region in transit. These funds have been applied, but they haven't yet been drawn upon. At least they hadn't been at the time of this presentation. And certainly, again, willing to have staff come and speak specifically to EAC for additional questions that you might have about these funds. Next slide. And then we have the American Recovery Plan, $30 billion nationally, and we're estimated for the 313.4 million to Metro Transit specifically. And so these funds have, at the time, had not been officially released, but like the CRR SAA funds, it takes some time for the FDA to make the details available and open the application process. We do know that the funds are going to be available through September 30th of 2024. And so I hope that this gives you at least, we'll move to the next slide and go a little further into that. And so there is an attachment that you can copy this link and go in and really look at how the American Rescue Plan Act was designated to be used, and it just gives you a quick, I think it's a 2-page sheet that you can take a look at to compare that to how the council is using it with the intent of the funds. And so in summary, available 100% is a federal share, and again, used for things like operations and payroll, and obligated through September 30th of 2024 and dispersed by September 30th of 2029. So those are the timelines. We wanted to at least make this available for the EAC so you can get that big picture and get those highlights. But any thoughts from the EAC about what we're able to share today? Or more specifically, what you want to know more about for staff to come back through a full EAC meeting or directly to the Transportation Subcommittee.
Cy, I am wondering, thank you for this information. They're really, really big numbers. And so I'm just wondering in the future if it's possible to have some sense of like what these numbers might mean in the context of Metro Transit, in as far as, you know, what funds would be available for Metro Transit, but also, you know, in relation to overall budget numbers or something like that, just to have a sense of the impact that it actually has versus just a number that's really large and hard to understand without knowing more.
Chair, committee members, I think what I'm hearing is your ask is the breakdown of those bigger numbers. And so, for example, if it is associated with payroll versus another part of operations or specific to transit safety, kind of a breakdown of where it actually went.
Well, I think you covered where it went, that 86% went, the CARES went to payroll. I think the question is, what percentage of payroll is that, right? Like, and then the future allocation is 313 million from ARP. What percentage of annual payroll is that? Is that 2 years, a half a year? But yeah, what I heard you say was the vast majority of the Metro Transit, it wasn't to Met Council, it was to Metro Transit as an agency, you know, as a, that's how the allocation came through, is to transit. And that the vast majority of that is planned to be spent on payroll, paying people to administer the system. So that are already on payroll. So that kind of answered my question. I was curious as to how the federal dollars will be allocated. I know they can be allocated towards lost revenue, to, you know, cover payroll for lost revenue and things. And so I think that was the main question I had last meeting. But yeah, to just augment Sarah's point, like, is 313 million half a year, 1 year, or 2 years of payroll? Like, I have no concept of how much it costs payroll to run that system. But other than that, I think this answers the question, which is where revenue replacement is how this money is being used. Thanks.
Chair, committee members, I think that's a good summary of my understanding as well. What I can add to that is I think the timeline is that designation and how they'd be used. I would get confirmation of this certainly and be able to get that back to you, but through 2024, yes. And just to add to that, and so that is how our funding overall works. So our federal funds do come specifically through the divisions such as Metro Transit or Environmental Services. There are no additional questions. I'll turn it over to Terri Smith and she'll walk you through HRA and be able to answer some questions directly about the allocation.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Terri Smith. I'm the director of the Council's Housing and Redevelopment Authority, known as Metro HRA, where we operate rent assistance programs for low-income families in the region. So I just have 3 slides here for you. We sort of got 3 buckets of federal funding related to coronavirus. So I just have 1 slide for each sort of bucket of funds. We were somewhat limited in terms of how we could use the funds, but I'll go through some of that. Next slide, please. So the first set of funds that we received were for the broader Housing Choice Voucher program, known as the Section 8 program. We currently operate a program size of serving about 7,000 families under that program. And we get sort of 2 buckets of funding under that program. One is for administrative fees. So that's the money for actual program operations, staffing, rent, phones, technology, rent, but the bulk of it is staffing costs. And then the other side of the funding is for the actual rent payments, rent subsidy payments that are paid to landlords on behalf of low-income families. So we got an additional 2.4 million in administrative fees in 2020. Our normal administrative fees that we get for program operating our program is 5 million. So we got another half of that, another 50% of that. And the rules required that we spend it by 12/31 or we lose it. And so the easiest way to allocate those funds, we dedicate it towards staffing costs, 100% of that. It included hiring additional staff to cover the increased workload. An example of increased workload is the rent subsidies and tenant rent payments are based on their income. So as families and individuals were experiencing reduced wages or lost employment due to the coronavirus, their income would go down, and that requires our staff to do an income change to reduce their rent. And just to give sort of set the context for that, in 2019, we processed 2,700 income changes, and in 2020, due to COVID-19, we processed 4,400. So an increase by 45% in income changes. So that's sort of an example of the increased workload. Under that same bucket, we received almost $5 million in subsidy payments funding. And so aside from coronavirus, at the same time, as you all probably know, the housing market is experiencing extreme rent increase and increases in rent across the board. And so if we hadn't received these funds, we would have been able to serve less families. But having this funding allowed us to cover the increased housing costs due to increasing rents. And that's not necessarily due to COVID-19, but they were increasing rents in general. And so what that did was allowed us to issue all possible housing vouchers. So serve 100% of our individuals and families that had housing choice vouchers. So that was really a win for us. Next slide, please. The second part of CARES Act funding we received was for mainstream housing vouchers. Prior to this award, we operated a mainstream voucher program of 156 households, mostly single individuals, but a few families. And we added 47 that were awarded with CARES Act funding. During 2020, the mainstream vouchers provide rent assistance to people living with disabilities and experiencing homelessness or that are at risk of homelessness. You've heard us talk about the Metro Transit Homeless Action Team, and the bulk of those vouchers, including the existing 203 vouchers, are used for connecting people that are experiencing homelessness and utilizing the transit system as non-destination riders or as shelter to housing, stability, and services. These vouchers also contain partnerships with Anoka, Hennepin, and Ramsey counties, and a handful of them went to people that are transitioning out of permanent supportive housing and received some of these mainstream vouchers. They are all in service and went into service pretty quickly. And the funding that came with those vouchers was $200,000 in administrative fees that covered staffing and included hiring additional staff to cover the increased workload, as I indicated on the previous slide, and then another $400,000 in subsidy payments to cover the cost of the rent subsidy of these 47 additional vouchers. And it was used, of course, to pay housing assistance payments to private landlords on behalf of those families with the vouchers. Next slide, please. And then the last funding that we received was actually through the American Recovery Act, and we're just getting this off the ground now. But were awarded 218 emergency housing vouchers. So from a national standpoint, $5 billion was dedicated from the federal government, and these are new vouchers that we've never had before. They're specific and have a lot more requirements than we've ever experienced with any vouchers that we operate, and we have several targeted allocations of vouchers. But they provide rent assistance to people who are experiencing homelessness, at risk of homelessness, recently homeless, or fleeing domestic violence. The rules are really specific and require memorandums of understanding with the counties in our service area, which include for us, Ramsey, Hennepin, and suburban metro area continuums of care. And the referrals for those vouchers must come through coordinated entry systems. So I don't know how familiar you are with coordinated entry, but it's a centralized intake and assessment system for people experiencing homelessness to get them connected to housing and services to achieve housing stability. And these vouchers came with $300,000 in administrative fees that will cover salaries and benefits. We're in the process of hiring some people to get these vouchers off the ground quickly. And we also will be getting $2.3 million in subsidy payments, of course, to cover the rent payments to represent these 218 housing vouchers. There are some funding incentives to getting these vouchers under lease quickly. And so we're gearing up our staff to make that happen. And so that's the last chunk of funding that we've received. I'm happy to answer any questions and provide more detail.
Quick question. This is Mohammed here. I know last time there were a couple of Metro HRA that were canceled due to lack of funding. Majority of some of the folks that I lost those vouchers were homeless people we were trying to house. I work for Hennepin County. So any update on that one? Are they getting their vouchers instead, because everything was held, was put on a hold due to funding?
Thank you for the question, Mohammed and Chair. So I think I understood your question. So somebody that lives in Hennepin County and their voucher was put on hold, and you're wondering if they're going to get their voucher back because of these new vouchers. Was that the question? Am I understanding that properly?
The issue was funding, federal funding. Now I think if you guys have extra funding, are you guys reinstating those vouchers that were put on hold at that time? I think a couple of months ago, like way in April, somewhere there. I don't remember exactly when.
Yes, Madam Chair and committee member. Yes, those. So on the previous slide, the first slide that I showed you, the additional almost $5 million in housing choice voucher subsidy payments that we got through the CARES Act, that made us whole last year. So we were able to serve all families, and now that impacted our funding for 2021. So we're getting additional funding in 2021. So all of those vouchers that were put on hold, all of the voucher holders have been in contact and should be in the process for getting their voucher back. So that's a different issue that's not connected to these emergency vouchers or any of this CARES Act funding. It's just we have enough funding this year now to serve all of our families. So all vouchers that were put on hold last year will be reissued. And I'm happy to connect with you offline and connect with the specific person if you have a specific person, but all of those vouchers should be coming back.
Thank you.
Hi, Terry. Leah, if it's okay, I have a question. So similar to the last question, kind of how many new vouchers did you get total, and what is that as a percentage of the total program? And then my second question is, what can we do to help? Are there any policy issues? Really, it sounds like pretty straightforward, very prescriptive is exactly what you can do with all these, but are there any points of policy discussion and or decisions that the EAC can be influential in?
Thank you for that question. If I may, Madam Chair, the total number of vouchers we received are 218 emergency housing vouchers and 47 mainstream vouchers, and our total program size is about 7,000. So it's a very small number, but it's impactful because it serves a very vulnerable population, particularly with the emergency housing vouchers. There are some financial incentives to get vouchers under lease by November 1st and January 1st of this year. And so we're just in the final stages of executing memorandums of understanding with the 3 continuums of care, and then we'll be able to hit the ground running by August 1st, getting people connected to housing stability. But our hands are kind of tied in terms of flexibility because the rules were pretty prescriptive in that we must go through coordinated entry. So individuals and families will be prioritized according to the prioritization system with the coordinated entry system, which gets complicated because it's different for all 3 continuums of care, as you probably know, Brianne, working in that area. But so we don't have much flexibility under these federal funds, but we will be coming before you regarding a new program that we're getting in some new federal funds for a mobility demonstration program. And so that will be on your calendar in some upcoming meeting. It's brand new, so we don't have much detail yet, but we will be engaging with you on that program where we do have some flexibility.
I have a question. This is Anita Ravina Davis. I've heard in the community lots of single moms, for example, saying that there's a wait list for housing to receive a voucher. And in the meantime, there's more homelessness. You just mentioned it. I appreciate the fact that you're looking at more funding for that. Is there a wait list currently? And if people you have, I see awarded 218 emergency housing vouchers, if there's anything for families in the meantime while they're waiting to get permanent housing?
Madam Chair and committee member, there's an extreme shortage of affordable housing in general. Waiting lists for a voucher are closed. They're long, not only here in the Twin Cities region, but all over the country. And I can give you an example of that. The Metro HRA last opened its waiting list in 2019. We opened in partnership with Minneapolis Public Housing and St. Paul Public Housing. They opened their voucher waiting list at the same time. And collectively, we got 44,000 application requests in a week. For Metro HRA, we got 17,400 application requests in 1 week. And due to our funding constraints and the number of people we can serve, we did a random placement of only 2,000 waiting list applicants. So that means 15,400 individuals and families did not even get placed on the list. So, and you know, it'll be a couple of years before we're able to even open our waiting list again, just due to the funds. You know, the broader number of vouchers that housing authorities have not increased in a general sense for many, 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 many years. And there are some of these specialty types of vouchers that are coming through, like the emergency vouchers and the mainstream vouchers, but just broader vouchers that serve low-income families without any special rules attached. There just aren't any new ones awarded. There are some federal conversations happening to provide voucher rent assistance to all eligible families. I'm not sure if that will go anywhere. It has to pass through Congress, of course. But making it an entitlement program so that those who are eligible get it would be a great, great system improvement, but it has a lot of hurdles before we get there.
Okay. I appreciate your answer.
I have another question, which is, can you explain the other end of the, what I would call the life cycle of the voucher? So you explained how people get on the list. Is there a time limit for how long people can receive a voucher, or is it tied to some sort of other characteristic? How do people exit the program?
Thank you for the question. So individuals and families on the program can stay on the program as long as they remain income eligible and as long as they are program compliant. So the average stay for a voucher holder is 8 years for our program of 7,000 people. It's, you know, people living with disabilities and persons that are aging populations tend to stay on a lot longer. Families with children sort of cycle off a little bit faster, but so they can stay as long as they want, as long as they're eligible. And I can also add, I think it might be helpful to know our average, you know, turnover, the number of families going off the voucher program has reduced over the last 5 years. I think, you know, due to the economy, people have been holding on to their vouchers a little longer. So that's, you know, essentially as one family goes off, we can bring another family on, and individuals and families just aren't going off as quickly as they used to.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I appreciate the the information, the questions that were raised, and the ideas for how we can have additional input. Thank you so much. Next on our agenda is to do the Metro Transit Police Safety Review update. And we're going to start with Michelle Fure giving us an overview of that work. And then we're going to bring on Anita to talk a little bit more about what's happening and give us some more context and places where we might get involved. So Michelle, are you ready?
I am ready. Arena, I assume, yep, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members, so much for the opportunity to provide you an update on the status of this work. We have been here before, and I had the Citizens League with me previously to give you some insight into how this project would evolve. And we are nearing the end of the public engagement portion of this overall project. So it's a good time for us to let you know where things are and then talk a little bit about some next steps. Go ahead and advance the slides, Rita. Thank you. So I'll start with the public engagement piece that is being facilitated through a partnership with the Citizens League and their partner in this engagement process, the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance. And they are overseeing the public engagement around the topic of transit safety and really helping clarify and define what transit safety means for different customers and neighbors, so folks who live near our system, businesses that are located near our system, so stops and stations and things like that. We've also included frontline employees on the transit system, and I'll talk about that in a second, but that's kind of how we've split up some of the work. The Citizens League has really been focusing primarily on those public constituencies and stakeholders in this process. As I mentioned, we're nearing the end. The Citizens League has been working hard with their team since late spring to really put boots on the ground to get out and talk to folks and really hear from the community about both their concerns about transit safety, but also some really exciting ideas that they have for how we might address some of these concerns. The Citizens League will be presenting some preliminary results to the full Metropolitan Council at its August 4th Committee of the Whole meeting. I'd certainly encourage you to watch that meeting if you're interested in some of the things that they'll be saying. I also fully expect that we'll be coming back to the Equity Advisory Committee at some point once the final results are complete to have a fuller conversation about how that information can be used going forward. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that our council members are going to be doing as well. We expect the full report, which will be a summary of the engagement, by September. That if there are any specific recommendations that the engagement has brought forward, the report will certainly contain that information, but it is largely intended to be a summary of the engagement and the major themes that we have heard in this process. Among the tools that the Citizens League team has been using is a survey, town hall meetings, virtual town hall meetings, some in-person engagement, particularly on the transit system and near the transit system, and then partner-based engagement, which really involves one-on-one or small group interactions with some key constituencies. And previously when we were here, we talked about the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, which Anita is serving on behalf of the Equity Committee, and we really appreciate that service, as well as a Community Advisory Committee that have been helping steer some of those aspects of the work. The Community Advisory Committee in particular has been structuring this community engagement effort, and the Stakeholder Committee gave some pretty important ideas around critical stakeholders to engage. So the Citizens League is wrapping up some of that work right now. I had an interaction with the team just this week about some of the additional things that are happening. So it's all coming fast and furious here as they work through the final engagement pieces and start to put that report together to deliver that to the council. You can advance the slide, thank you. So engaging frontline employees. So we spent some considerable time this late spring here and early summer going to as many of the on-site locations as possible to engage both operators on the bus system, on the light rail system, and also to talk to folks who are involved with maintenance, both of our vehicles, but also our stations and our stops. And, you know, people who are out, you know, for example, cleaning the platforms on the light rail system, and, you know, others who are involved with, you know, maintenance on the trains when they come into the operating facility at the end of a run, for example. And, you know, there was also some small group engagement. There's a transit safety committee that some employees at Metro Transit are leaders of. So we talked with them and we met with some of their work. And we also did an internal survey of employees to just get a sense, particularly from frontline employees, of, you know, where they are, what they're feeling, and where some of their, you know, primary concerns are. We got overwhelming response. It was really tremendous. People came in off shift to participate in these conversations and to really give us some pretty, you know, deep engagement, or some deep feedback that was very personal to them, but to, you know, really invest time in, you know, being really clear about some of the concerns and needs that they feel as employees need to be addressed on our system related to safety. It was really, I was involved in a lot of that engagement, so I had the opportunity to interact with folks. It was really great opportunity to hear directly from individuals who maybe haven't had an opportunity to necessarily talk about these things directly in an effort like this, with you know, all of that information being put together and delivered to the council at this point in time. I would say that a lot of the themes that have come out of the frontline employee engagement is not that dissimilar from the initial things that we've heard from the community, that they're very concerned about the system being able to support customers, particularly those who need transit, who are reliant upon transit to, you know, get to and from the places they want to go. But as we're emerging from this pandemic, it's really going to be important to make sure that the transit system is working for the people of this region. And that came through loud and clear, both from a public engagement perspective, as well as from the frontline employees. And the frontline employees also had a lot to say about the presence of some sort of, you know, not necessarily a police officer, but some sort of authority figure to deal with some of the situations that are cropping up on our system. They just feel like drivers in particular, the bus drivers in particular, are being asked to deal with a number of different circumstances and situations while they're operating a significantly, you know, large machine on the roads, keeping our customers safe, keeping people, you know, pedestrians and others on the streets safe. So those were all themes that came out of that frontline engagement, and it really does point to, you know, some pretty important things that our council members can take and you know, make some not only recommendations on, but have some actions related to. You can advance the slide. Thank you. So what's next? As I mentioned, we'll get a summary of the public engagement. There will also be a memorandum summarizing the frontline employee engagement, and those will all be compiled together and presented to the council. We'll also communicate those results to participants, to the community, and then to, you know, stakeholders who have all participated in this process, and that includes this committee. So I'd be happy to come back at some point and bring the Citizens League folks with me to talk a little bit more about the details of what they learned, and, you know, really the spirit of where that came from. Just to give you some sort of recent news, at last month's or the first committee of the whole meeting of this month, our council heard from Chief Frizzell on some policies that, you know, some of the policy framework that we have around policing, that, you know, most of which is required by state law, but just giving a sense of you know, all of the different policies that the police department is required to create. And then they had quite a deep discussion about use of force policies in particular. And that was really the first conversation at the council level to begin more of the review of our police department and its practices. The council will be dedicating at least one committee of the whole meeting a month moving forward into at least early 2022 to discuss these issues more fully in, you know, in a public meeting space. And the council members are going to be forming a working group to dig into the issues that have already been identified both by the council, the community, and certainly our frontline employees to address any police policies and practices that need their recommendations through, as I mentioned, at least early 2022. So they'll be directing the council members on this working group will be deciding what the topics are at the committee of the whole meetings each month, and then also recommending any actions that staff may provide to support the fuller review of our police policies and practices moving into early next year. There's quite a bit of urgency, I would just say, among our council members to actually have these conversations. So it's been really good to see the momentum as we're starting to hear some of the results. But when we get the fuller results from public engagement and frontline employee engagement, I think that's really going to feed those priorities that the council members can sort of sink their teeth into. So that's a high level sort of here's where we're at. Absolutely, happy to answer any questions that you might have tonight, and or come back with more complete information as that report comes together, because it won't be long here. We'll be in the next several weeks here getting all of that together, and happy to come either next month or perhaps in September too, if that's something that you would like.
Hi, this is T. Thank you, Michelle, for coming. I just was wondering, have they suggested what kind of authority figures besides cops would be on the transit, and what kind of situations were they thinking that these authority figures would be dealing with?
Thank you, T and Madam Chair, for that question. So what frontline employees were suggesting was a more general sort of, a security person. What we have announced last week, the transit folks and Terri announced an effort to get more community service officers on our system. Community service officers are not sworn law enforcement. They do not carry firearms. They are not allowed to, because they're not authorized to, they're not allowed to arrest people or issue any kind of ticket. But they can be present, they can help with problem solving and diffusing or de-escalating situations. And they are typically in some kind of uniform, though it's not the same kind of uniform that a police officer might wear. So that gives a lot of the, that is somewhat responsive to some of the suggestions that the frontline employees had, but that is currently sort of in the process for Metro Transit to be putting that into place here in the coming months. I'm not privy to the full details about that, but I, at a high level, that is what I am aware of. And if you have any additional questions about that, we can certainly have someone report back to you.
Thank you.
Are there other questions of Michelle before we move on to hearing what's coming from the public engagement?
Madam Chair, not a question, but just a comment. Just wanted to say that very similar discussions happening in the municipality that I work for, very, very similar. And so while Metro Transit probably has a unique set of I was going to say issues and responses and budget and constraints, it's probably very similar to the larger discussion happening right now in municipal police forces. And just wanted to say that mental health, substance abuse, and I'll add housing, that although that's not an issue that's come up in the community I work for, but housing, transit as a form of housing, I suppose, those are the issues that are really continuing to rise to the top of the discussion. And frankly, the police have acknowledged they're not equipped to be dealing with those issues. And so I think just this is a broader reflection that community service officer or not, having professionals who actually know how to deal with those issues, which are the root issues, is really important and is something that is continuing on a, in a bigger city by city, but potentially regional basis just were coming to an head about the fact that most of the issues that the police are responding to are not police issues. And yet there's nobody else identified or systems in place to supplant them. And so just amplify and hear your experience both with the drivers and with the police themselves, and that it's not unique to the transit system, but to public safety response in general.
Madam Chair, if I could respond to that, this is Anita. As the part of that discussion, I had an opportunity to have a discussion with Chief Frizzell. Chief Frizzell and I go back 17 years when he was part of the Minneapolis Police and was part of the mediation agreement that we had with the Department of Justice, community members, and the Minneapolis Police. So he is, he contributed to that original language of the mediation. We've had some discussions recently about mental and behavioral health. And it's not just mental health per se, it's behavioral health too, that's the conductors and the police are dealing with on a daily basis. And part of that discussion that we've had about safety, individual safety, riding on public transportation was not just safety for ourselves, but safety around the police too, for ourselves. So I would say that Chief Frizzell has been a large part of that discussion on behalf of the Metro Transit. And I appreciate that. He and I have had discussions in the future, and I continue to work with the Minneapolis Police on that issue. And as Chief Frizzell was part of that, he knows the same people that I know, and we're having those conversations. So he is continuing to be in that conversation regarding community and mental health, behavioral health, and homelessness. So I just wanted to put that out there for everybody here to understand that he's very active in that.
Thank you so much, Anita. And I would love to turn it over to you now to tell a little bit about the public engagement process, if that's okay.
I just wanted to update you all on the process, because if Irina could, if you could put that PDF file up. And if you want these, we can have Irina send those out to us if you would like a copy of it. Mostly, I want you to know what the process is, so, because I would urge each and every one of you, if you are contacted to become part of these stakeholder conversations or any conversations on behalf of EAC, please, you know, take part in that. It was helpful for me, and I hope I contributed a lot to that conversation for the Met Council and the Citizens League. But if, as you can see, we met, as the process went, we met once a month. I believe it was once a month, right, Michelle? Okay. And we had about an hour and a half, 2-hour discussions, and we broke off into little groups, starting with our own perceptions of what do we feel safety means while we're on public transportation. And then we were put into little groups and then back to the larger group. So here's an example of an agenda that we got. And basically we were told at the beginning when we had our first meeting in February, what our role was. And we were as stakeholders to contribute to that conversation and talk about what we feel, each of us coming from different areas, and me as a community member and using public transportation, my perceptions, my views, and my experiences, and what safety meant to me. One of the things I think I reminded you about last meeting was, as I got older, as I grow older, my safety concerns change. When I was younger, I could ride public transportation, put on my headphones, and just make sure I got off at the right stop. Now that I'm older, I'm more aware, because I'm more aware that if somebody tries to grab my purse and I'm pulled forward, that hurts. I can break a bone now. or loud noises affect me differently too. So aging, and we have to consider seniors on public transportation, how their perception is versus younger generations. And so that was one of the discussions that I was able to contribute, how I became aware of that as I aged. One of the things that I wanted to bring to you tonight is the discussion that we had was we put a list together, and Irina, if you could put up the Word document, please. And while we're waiting for that, we contributed information and ideas of where to go to do the surveys and the town halls and the in-person engagement and the partner-based engagement. And so if you could scroll down, Irina, to the list of organizations. And I don't know if you can see that. Can you make that a little bit bigger? I don't know how everybody's views are. Mine are terrible. Okay, so we have a list here, stakeholders list. Does anybody need to have Irina make that bigger? Okay, thank you so much. So you can see we have a list of business associations that we talked about, people that would give their staff, for example, an MTC Riders Pass card, if they could get it at discount prices. Organizations like the Lake Street Council, businesses, St. Paul Improvement District, the Minneapolis Downtown Council, a lot of those business associations that would benefit from the ridership or give that information out to residents of the cities. Also community organizations, for example, the American Indian Community, the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center, Adventures for Youth. These were just lists of community organizations that we were aware of that could benefit from having surveys or being, those one-on-one conversations. Government organizations, because as I mentioned before, when I worked at Hennepin, we were offered a pass at a discount rate. And so the ridership, people coming to and from, are using public transportation, and that transportation and being there on time and that safety and coming early in the morning, some of those folks are starting to get on public transportation at 5 o'clock in the morning when it's still dark. And also those education partners. If you could scroll down or up, there you go. Thank you. Education partners, schools, community colleges, the University of Minnesota, where the students would be riding the buses, especially the high schools, where the young people are riding buses now more so than taking a school bus like the younger kids are. Healthcare partners, where people who are going to and from their appointments are relying on public transportation. And then private partners, like the convention center, people going to go see what's going on at the convention center, going to see an exhibit. So herein is a list, and while the information is almost done, I think if we've missed anything, if you are aware as members, that would be helpful to get back to Michelle. If you don't see anything, and maybe if Irina can send that out, I'd appreciate that, especially this list, this Word doc, so that all the members can look at it, because you all have affiliations with different organizations, government agencies, education, healthcare, etc. And so if you don't see anybody in there but you think could benefit, I think that it would be helpful for Michelle to have that information.
Madam Chair, just one note. Anita mentioned the education, the high school students, and they aren't explicitly listed on this list of people, but they have absolutely been engaged, and we've been working closely with the high school students that are using the transit system and their parents. So that is a piece that you might not see on this list, but they have been engaged in that process. I would just echo that it would be really helpful to have any feedback you have on these things. The work is wrapping up at this phase, but that doesn't mean we're done talking about this. And we absolutely will be following up long-term with partners and other stakeholders as this evolves further.
Okay. Like I said earlier, I did enjoy the process, and again, I would urge any of you, if you're contacted to participate in it, I would say do that. It was a learning process for me too. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your service on that, Anita. And before we move on, I'd love to hear what questions people have or comments or thoughts.
This is Cy Jordan, Director of Equal Opportunity. It appears we momentarily lost Leah and we don't have a co-chair for tonight's meeting. So I will jump in, and if there's no further questions, then we can move on to the input on USDOT request for information on equity. Unfortunately, is leading that conversation, but I'm not certain if Heidi is on the line. There we go.
I am here if you need me.
Yes. And so Heidi has shared out some information about the council's input, additional information about the process. It did come out today shortly before the meeting, and so maybe Heidi could give a little introduction to that while Leah gets connected again.
Thank you. I am back now, but I am happy for Heidi to take that on while I get myself oriented.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, members. Happy to be here. So I'm Heidi Schallberg, a transportation planner in MTS. And just, I think you had this on your agenda last month, is my understanding. And I don't know if any of you had a chance to view the information session that the U.S. Department of Transportation had earlier this month about this request for information about equity in transportation. They are doing this to help inform some of their work, that they're meeting an internal deadline from the White House to all agencies. They are using what they learned from this request for information to help inform their work plan for an equity task force that they're creating agency-wide. They're also doing an agency-wide equity plan when they're updating their strategic plan. They did share at that information session that this will not be the only opportunity. So if people are unable to meet this deadline or have additional thoughts later, they did indicate that there would be other opportunities in the future to engage with them in this administration and kind of a renewed focus on equity. And again, this is kind of a follow-up to an executive order that President Biden issued earlier this year. So I think I had sent in the email just kind of a summary, just higher level, like which questions staff had initially identified as ones that we thought we would have some meaningful responses to share with USDOT. So there's a long list of the question numbers, but overall it was 17 out of the 25. There are 25 questions in 3 subject areas. Some of these questions are kind of from the council-wide one, just more technical in nature about needing specific types of data or specific data that they have now that would be useful if they could expand or share. And then of course, I believe you would have heard about the equity considerations data set that our research department has done in the past. And so also referencing that work that we've done. And then Metro Transit staff is also coordinated, so coordinated within Metro Transit and then across the council on the response. And so their response is really focusing on the methodology that they use relating to transit-specific equity metrics. And so those were kind of described in the write-up there. And then some of their analysis that their rider demographics differ from our overall regional demographics, and that just looking at demographics regionally are not linked to ridership or just people living near stops, that that's not a representative approach. I'm not sure what the discussion has been within the committee as far as submitting comments. This is an ideal situation. I understand things are not always ideal. USDOT did indicate a preference, if possible, for agencies to submit one response collectively, understanding that a lot of agencies such as ours and departments of transportation are coordinating across different units. If the EAC was interested in providing comments collectively, if that would be possible, I think that would be appreciated. Certainly not a requirement, but due to the kind of the short turnaround time with the deadline this Thursday at 4, we would appreciate some indication if that's something that you would want to do to coordinate to include EAC comments in what we submit on Thursday. We would need, just some logistics time to be able to do that. And also just comments can be submitted individually too. So any individual in the US can submit comments as well. So I think they're expecting a range of responses from academics, practitioners, and the public. So I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for jumping in with that, Heidi. Well, in between me getting kicked off the WebEx. And I did identify a couple places that aligned with things that the EAC has talked about in the past, where I thought we could have a short discussion now as a way of giving input. And then we can assess at the end if we want to provide additional input as well outside of the meeting before the deadline on Thursday. What I remember from prior conversations, for example, around the definition of equity, transportation equity that we had, I believe it was last month or the month before, and conversations with the research department. Some of the themes that have come up are having disaggregated data that really gets at the issues that individuals are interested in and the effects and impact on individuals, and making sure that that data is looked at through an asset-based as well as a deficit-based lens. So I identified a couple questions that I thought were relevant to those discussions that perhaps as a committee we could give a little bit of input on. The first one is this question 2, where you see that staff has already started to add content. I thought in particular that this committee might have some ideas about data sources that would be required to for an assessment of equity in federal funding distributions that we as committee members might be aware of or have experienced in our communities or in our work that we would want to advise the council to consider.
Leah, the first thing that comes to my mind is the racial equity tool kit or tool, and that's used for a variety of different things. But the most salient question on that tool is who benefits from the policy or program or allocation and who loses or who doesn't benefit. And then are the people who are most impacted part and integral to the decision? Those are two really high level questions we can ask every funding allocation, every policy, every program, who is benefiting and who is not. And are the people who are most impacted part of the decision? And so to me, that's been really helpful in trying to evaluate what an equity lens looks like. And it's real generic. So I think it can apply to a variety of different things. I'm not sure that was your question, Leah, but when I was looking at those questions on the page, that's the first thing that came to my mind. So how do we measure equity? Are the people most impacted part of the decision? And are we even asking who benefits and who loses by the transportation decision that we're making? So
I would like to add one additional bit to that, which is that it is equally important to see disproportionate benefit as it is to see disproportionate disadvantage, to see who is, you could draw a pretty straight line between who was at the table to make decisions and who benefited the most from them. And so to make sure that any kind of analysis or data is looking at both disproportionate benefits and disproportionate burden. Do other committee members have things that they'd like to add?
I think one of the challenges I see is that it's really difficult to talk about equity on a national level, especially when it comes to transportation, partly because I think transportation decisions tend to have such long timelines. And the other piece is that, you know, kind of getting to my question earlier, but, you know, the FTA could distribute funding to the to Metro Transit, but it really then is up to Metro Transit to spend that money in a manner that honors the equity and disparities that we have in this particular region, right? So it's like, it is one thing for the feds to distribute funds to transit agencies. It is yet another thing for the transit agencies themselves to use equity to inform the decisions about how they spend those funds. So I just feel like it's very trickle down, and I understand that the feds can require grantee reporting in certain ways, but I just think that it's challenging.
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
I think, Heidi, you did with the Department of Transportation, correct? Are you
I am a transportation planner at the council within MTS. So
okay.
in our long range planning division in the MTS division.
Okay. The reason I ask is because a couple of years ago, I contracted with the Department of Transportation on their I-94 East construction and did engagement, community engagement, and they should have that data, because what we did when I worked with them was I went out to communities within that corridor, specifically multicultural communities, and the Department of Transportation created relationships with those organizations representing the communities and had meetings and conversations and engagement of how the construction would impact them, how signage impacted certain drivers, how access, and especially signage concerning construction, like which street was closed, and some of those barriers that they would have, like universal signage was easier than, you know, such and such a street is closed until such and such a date. And that might be something, it takes time and it takes money. And so if you're looking at funding to get that data, you're going to need money for the funding, for the time to do this. Plus, what does it mean for the people who are impacted? And so if you're going to do that engagement, there's kind of a give and take for that. You know, if they're going to give you information, what are you going to give to them? And that's why I mean that the time comes in to have those conversations. Because when you're looking to collect data, the quantitative versus qualitative, and what are you getting? You're getting the qualitative data because you can't have those individual conversations of everybody who gets on the road, gets in their car or public transportation, gets, you know, going. You can't have that. And so you're not going to have those numbers per se in data, but you're going to have how that impacts if you have those conversations, those direct conversations. And so that's the thing to me, when I look at things like this, how do you change that process of having those true engagement conversations rather than this is what we're doing, this is how it's going to impact you, and this is the date we're doing it. And I think that's what we're currently going through right now. We go through that a lot. So it's a whole change way of thinking of how everybody does their job.
Agreed.
One other thought that comes to my mind is acknowledging and understanding the historical damage that the U.S. DOT has reported on perpetrated on communities. So every single project having a very clear and frank conversation about the neighborhood that the project that they're talking about wrecked the first time or damaged or traumatized the first time, like having federal and state and local transportation officials first acknowledge, like I think of the statements that of inclusion about like acknowledging the land that we're on is Native American soil and has been taken from the Native American people, you know, just that acknowledgement and understanding. And it gets tucked away in an EAW somewhere or an EIS somewhere, but how can we bring that to the forefront of the public policy discussion about what should be there? So I think even though that's not measurable or quantifiable, I think just having that as a part of the equity analysis, or is this equitable? First, how much damage did it create and to who? And then moving forward, can we undo that? And I think that was getting a little bit at Leah's point, like disparate benefit, disparate impact. And how do we undo some of the major damage the U.S. DOT has done to the communities since the 40s and 50s?
I think a lot of what's been shared relates to these first set of questions. There was another set of questions that I was hoping we could look at as a group. And Arena, I'm wondering if you could scroll down to the questions 16 and 17 about the environment. The environment and then what we might see at the individual person level. I'm wondering if those inspire any additional thoughts from our committee members.
There are a lot of environmental justice groups now. The PCA, the MPCA has their environmental justice committee that could probably help with some of that feedback. In Minneapolis, we have the North and South green zones. And we do talk about the air quality related to the freeways and highways that go through both. And also now we're talking about the Upper Harbor Terminal over here in North Minneapolis, and what digging in some of that old toxic dirt, you know, how deep that is and what it's going to create when that, you know, the construction begins. And so those conversations are all ongoing, but you can call both the PCA and the city of Minneapolis, and there are a lot of other organizations like Sierra Club. There's water conservation groups that could probably help with some of those questions about environmental justice. But it is an issue that we as community members do have and have ongoing discussions about. I would say right now that the MPCA has a lot of data because they work with all the environmental justice groups that are in the state.
Thank you. Do other committee members have anything they'd like to add around either 16 or 17?
I just want to augment what Anita said about engagement. These questions bug me because they're very performative, and they're very prescriptive. But to me, it's all about engagement. Are you listening to the people most affected by the program or the policy or the funding allocation? Are you doing what they say that we should be doing? You know, community engagement is listening, but it's also doing what people say when you engage them. And I know that's not easy, to Anita's point, coming up with creative and innovative ways of doing that, reaching people, which we just listened for 20 minutes on all the ways to reach people for transit surveys. These questions seem like they're just performative, like, can we check boxes so that we can say we're doing equity? But it's really about the people, the stories, the history, the qualitative stuff. And so I just wanted to augment what Anita said, that you can't come up with a model, an equity outcome model, in my opinion. Like, that's not a thing. But can be in community and listen to community, and that's, I believe, the only way to really implement equitable policy.
Mhm.
I'd like to speak to question 16 specifically, and that is that I think this is really not necessarily about the DOT. It is about the DOT and being in collaboration and communication with the EPA and with Health and Human Services and possibly with HUD or whoever, to really think about what it means to actually live somewhere and experience the air and experience the access to healthcare, and how all of that actually comes together to create somebody's life. Because unless these agencies get out of their silos and start thinking about what happens to people instead of what happens within their individual programs, they're not going to be able to really deliver different kinds of solutions.
Mhm.
I have one more question that I suggest we look at, but before we move on to that one, I want to see if there's any more comments about 16 and 17 here that people would like to make. Arena, can you scroll down so we can see 23? This one stood out to me because earlier in our meeting, we did talk about some workforce equity programs that are being done through some of that special funding by the Met Council. We've talked a lot about workforce here at our EAC meetings, so I'm curious if anything here around 23 comes to mind that we would recommend the DOT look at. All right, I think we will end this part of our agenda now, but Heidi, I hope some of the conversation we've had have been useful to you in your planning for your response. You can feel free to take what you heard and weave it in. And then to our committee, I do want to encourage you, if you'd like to do a separate response, I'll follow up with an email tomorrow morning to say that would have to happen very quickly. And so we could certainly do it, but it would have to be really fast. So I'll follow up with an email and see if there's appetite for that. But I want to appreciate everybody and thank you, Heidi, for coming to talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your discussion.
Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you.
All right. Well, now we are going to move on to the part of our agenda where it's announcements. So does anybody have any announcements that they'd like to make? All right, I will make a couple announcements of my own. Our standing committee meets every month the week after the EAC meets. And at the standing committee meeting, we take time to plan our agendas for future meetings and also identify topics for discussion. And we're going to be spending a little bit of time at the next few standing committee meetings working on the EAC itself, some ways of getting to know each other and really support our work with each other. Please attend the standing committee if you're able to. Your input is really important to helping set the agenda. Today's agenda all came with suggestions from the standing committee last month, so really appreciate when you are able to attend. And our next meeting is going to be a week from today on Tuesday, July 27th from 5:30 to 6:30. One thing that we are going to be doing at our standing committees starting this month, the 27th, is we're going to actually be developing our topics for the next two the next two EAC meetings rather than just one. That will give staff a chance to coordinate some of our speakers and presenters and people that we want to be giving us information. In case they're not available at the very next meeting, they could always hop into the one after that. So at this next standing committee, we're going to be looking 2 months ahead for our agenda items. And the last thing I wanted to give an update about, and then I'll just check one more time for other announcements, is that our liaison for committee appointments has been attending to other responsibilities and assigned to other responsibilities for the last couple months. We hope to have an update soon about what our process is going to be for filling our vacancies and a couple other decision points for this committee to make about committee vacancies. So stay tuned. That should be coming soon as our liaison is back and available to work with us. Any further questions, comments, announcements before we adjourn for the evening?
Nope. You had enough lately?
Great job, Leah. Great job.
Thank you, everybody. It's always a treat to see you and hear your wonderful ideas, and look forward to seeing many of you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.